The summer sun cast a warm, golden glow over the quiet streets of Evergreen Heights, a suburban neighborhood known for its perfectly manicured lawns and picturesque homes. It was the kind of place where people took pride in their properties, and everyone knew each other by name. But today, something was different. A large moving truck was parked in front of a two-story house on Maple Avenue, the sound of boxes being shuffled and furniture being moved, breaking the usual tranquility. The Henderson family had arrived. Marcus Henderson, a tall man with a confident stride, directed the movers as they unloaded the truck. His wife Lisa, a striking woman with a sharp mind and a kind heart, was inside organizing the boxes that had already been brought in. Their two children, Jasmine and Elijah, were running around the front yard, excitedly exploring their new home. Jasmine, at 16, was just beginning to develop a sense of independence, while 10-year-old Elijah was full of energy and curiosity. As Marcus paused to take a sip of water, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered across the street. They were watching, whispering among themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity and something less friendly. Marcus offered a polite wave, but only one woman, Mrs. Parker, returned the gesture with a half-hearted smile before turning back to the group. "They're watching us like we're some kind of spectacle," Lisa commented as she joined Marcus on the front steps. "They probably just need time to adjust to new faces," Marcus replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that their reception wasn't as warm as it could have been. Later that afternoon, as the family settled into their new home, Lisa received a knock on the door. It was Mr. Miller, a stout man in his early 60s with graying hair and a stern expression. Behind him stood a few other neighbors, including Mrs. Johnson, a petite woman with sharp features, and Mr. Parker, a tall man who seemed to hover silently in the background. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mr. Miller said, though his tone lacked warmth. "I'm Mr. Miller. We thought we'd come by and introduce ourselves." Lisa smiled, hoping to break the ice. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. We're the Hendersons, Marcus, Lisa, Jasmine, and Elijah. It's great to meet you all." Mr. Miller glanced over at Marcus, who had just joined them at the door. "So, what brings you to Evergreen Heights?" he asked, as though the Hendersons' presence required some kind of explanation. "We've been looking for a place like this for a while," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. "We've always wanted to live in a neighborhood like this. Good schools, safe streets, a strong sense of community." Mr. Miller nodded slowly, but his eyes held a critical glint. "Yes, it's a nice place. We've all been here for quite some time. We like to keep things consistent." There was an uncomfortable pause before Mrs. Johnson chimed in, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I hope you'll find everything to your liking here. We're a close-knit community, very particular about how things are done." "We're looking forward to being a part of it," Lisa replied, refusing to let the subtle hostility faze her. As the neighbors left, Marcus and Lisa exchanged a glance. They had both sensed the underlying tension, the unspoken message that they were not entirely welcome. Days passed, and the subtle signs of discomfort from the neighbors continued. The Hendersons noticed that when they walked down the street, conversations would stop, and the friendly smiles that were once abundant seemed reserved for others. They received no invitations to the usual neighborhood barbecues or gatherings that seemed to happen frequently in other people's yards. One evening, Jasmine came home upset. "Mom, Dad, the kids at school are acting weird. Some of them wouldn't sit with me at lunch today, and one girl said her parents don't think we should be living here." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "We knew there might be some challenges, Jazzy, but remember, we belong here just as much as anyone else." Elijah, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, asked, "Why don't they like us? We haven't done anything wrong." Lisa knelt down to Elijah's level, brushing his curls back. "Sometimes people judge others before they even get to know them. It's not right, but we can't let it change who we are. We have to be strong together." That night, as the family sat down for dinner, they found an envelope slipped under their front door. Marcus picked it up and opened it, his face hardening as he read the contents. Inside was a typed note, unsigned. "You don't belong here. Leave now, before it's too late." Lisa's eyes filled with concern as she read over his shoulder. This isn't just about being unfriendly, Marcus. This is a threat. Marcus folded the note and set it aside, his expression determined. We're not going anywhere. They don't know who they're dealing with. The days following the anonymous threat were tense. Marcus and Lisa had decided to keep the note a secret from the children, not wanting to scare them. But the message weighed heavily on their minds. As the Hendersons went about their daily routines, the undercurrent of hostility in the neighborhood became more pronounced. One morning, as Marcus was heading out for work, he noticed something off about his car. The tires were deflated, and a closer inspection revealed long, deep scratches running along the sides of the vehicle. He clenched his fists in anger, but then took a deep breath to steady himself. Reporting this to the police would likely do little, and he knew that reacting impulsively could escalate the situation. Lisa, already aware of the increasing tension, was not surprised when Marcus told her what had happened. "They're trying to push us out," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "But they're going to find out we're not so easily intimidated." "That's right," Marcus agreed. "They've crossed a line, but we need to be smart about how we handle this. They don't know who they're messing with." Later that day, Lisa decided to reach out to the local homeowners association. She wanted to make sure they were aware of the harassment and to gauge their reaction. When she called, she was met with an icy reception. "We'll look into it," the association president, Mr. Thompson, said curtly. "But I have to tell you, we've never had any issues like this in the past. Maybe you're just misinterpreting things." "Misinterpreting?" Lisa repeated, incredulous. "Someone vandalized our car and sent us a threatening note. How am I supposed to interpret that?" "Look, Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Thompson replied, clearly eager to end the conversation. "I'll see what I can do, but my advice is to keep a low profile. Things tend to work themselves out if you don't stir the pot." Lisa hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. It was clear that they were on their own, but rather than feeling defeated, she felt a surge of determination. "If they think we're going to back down, they're wrong," she muttered to herself. Meanwhile, Marcus began making discreet inquiries into the history of the neighborhood. He knew that understanding the dynamics at play could give them an advantage. He spent hours combing through property records, learning about the ownership and development of the area. It wasn't long before he started to notice a pattern. Many of the houses in the neighborhood were owned by a single real estate company, one that had deep ties to the community and a long history of discrimination. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus began formulating a plan. He didn't want to simply defend his family. He wanted to turn the tables on those who sought to harm them. The tipping point came one evening when the Hendersons returned home from a rare night out. They found their front lawn littered with garbage, rotten food, broken glass, and old newspapers scattered across the grass. A crude message was spray-painted on their garage door. "Get out!" Lisa gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as she took in the scene. Marcus, standing beside her, felt a cold fury rise within him. This was no longer just about making a stand. It was about showing these people that their actions had consequences. "We're not just going to sit here and take this," Marcus said, his voice firm. "It's time we fight back." That night, after cleaning up the mess, Marcus gathered his family around the dining table. He shared with them what he had discovered, about the ownership of the neighborhood, about the people who had orchestrated their harassment, and about their own power to change the situation. "We own this house," Marcus began, his voice calm but resolute. "But what you don't know is that we own more than that. We own this entire block. Every house that's been giving us trouble belongs to us." Jasmine and Elijah looked at their father in surprise. "How?" Jasmine asked, trying to process what this meant. "I've been investing in real estate for years," Marcus explained, "and I knew when we moved here that this neighborhood had potential. What I didn't know was that the people living here would try to drive us out. But now that I do, we're going to use our position to put an end to this." Lisa looked at her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. "What are you planning, Marcus?" "I'm going to confront them. At the next neighborhood meeting, I'll present the facts. They've been paying rent to us without even knowing it. They want to evict us, but they have no idea that they're trying to evict their own landlords." The family sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Then, one by one, they nodded in agreement. They would face this challenge together, and they would not be intimidated. The next few days were spent preparing for the upcoming meeting. Marcus gathered all the necessary documents, making sure every detail was in order. Lisa offered to go with him, but he insisted on going alone, not wanting to put her in a potentially volatile situation. Finally, the night of the meeting arrived. Marcus walked into the community center, his head held high. The room fell silent as he entered. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, but he refused to be daunted. He was there to reclaim his family's dignity, and nothing was going to stand in his way. The tension in the community center was thick as Marcus entered the room. The usual pleasantries of neighborhood meetings were absent. Instead, the residents sat stiffly in their chairs, their eyes narrowing as they watched him approach. Marcus could sense the hostility in the air, but he had come prepared, both mentally and emotionally. This was his moment to stand up, not just for his family, but for the principle that no one should be made to feel unwelcome in their own home. Mr. Miller, who seemed to have taken on the unofficial role of leader among the neighbors, stood at the front of the room, shuffling papers. He glanced up as Marcus approached, and with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes, said, "Ah, Mr. Henderson, glad you could join us tonight." Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, keeping his expression neutral. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I understand there are some concerns about our presence here, and I thought it was time we addressed them directly." A murmur rippled through the room, with some neighbors exchanging knowing looks. Mr. Miller cleared his throat and gestured for Marcus to take a seat, but Marcus remained standing. He could see the anticipation in their eyes. They were expecting him to defend himself, to plead for acceptance. But he had no intention of doing either. "Before we get into tonight's agenda," Marcus began, his voice calm and steady, "I'd like to address something that has been weighing heavily on my family and me. Since we moved here, it's become increasingly clear that not everyone is happy with our presence. We've received threats, had our property vandalized, and been subjected to a level of hostility that is both unwarranted and unacceptable." The room fell silent. Marcus could see the discomfort on their faces, but he pressed on. "I want to make it very clear that my family is here to stay. We have every right to be here, just as much as anyone else in this room. But what some of you may not realize is that our ties to this neighborhood go much deeper than just our home." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, placing them on the table in front of him. "These are the property records for every house on this block. And as it turns out, they all have something in common. They're owned by the same entity. That entity happens to be a real estate company I've built over the years." There were gasps from around the room, and Mr. Miller's face drained of color. He quickly composed himself, though, and tried to regain control of the situation. "I don't see how this is relevant, Mr. Henderson. We're here to discuss community matters, not your business ventures." "Oh, but it's very relevant," Marcus replied, his gaze locking onto Mr. Miller's. "Because it seems that while some of you were busy trying to make my family feel unwelcome, you were unaware that you were trying to evict your own landlord." A stunned silence followed. The realization began to dawn on the neighbors, and Marcus could see the shift in their expressions, from smug superiority to shock, and in some cases, fear. Mr. Miller's bluster faltered as he looked around the room, his usual allies now uncertain and shaken. "I have no interest in making anyone uncomfortable," Marcus continued, his tone firm but reasonable. "But let's be clear. The attempts to harass and intimidate my family stop now. We're not going anywhere, and any further actions against us will be dealt with accordingly, both legally and financially." He paused, letting his words sink in. He could see some of the neighbors exchanging uneasy glances, the reality of their situation finally setting in. One woman, Mrs. Parker, who had earlier been part of the group watching the Hendersons move in, raised her hand hesitantly. "Henderson," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "we had no idea. I don't agree with how things have been handled. Maybe we could start over?" Marcus gave her a small nod. "I'm open to that, Mrs. Parker, but it has to be genuine. My family and I deserve the same respect and consideration as anyone else here." There were murmurs of agreement from a few others in the room, but Marcus could still sense the underlying tension. Mr. Miller, however, was not ready to give in so easily. "This changes nothing," Mr. Miller said, his voice rising as he tried to rally the others. "Just because you own the property doesn't mean you can dictate how we live our lives. We have standards here, Mr. Henderson, and some of us aren't willing to lower them." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking anyone to lower their standards, Mr. Miller. I'm asking for fairness, for decency. If you can't offer that, then maybe it's you who needs to reconsider where you live." The room was electric with tension. For a moment, it seemed as though things might spiral out of control. But then Mrs. Johnson, who had been one of the more vocal opponents of the Hendersons, stood up. She looked at Marcus, then at the rest of the neighbors, and said quietly, "We've let things get out of hand. I don't agree with how this has been handled either. It's time to move forward." Her words seemed to break the spell. One by one, others began to nod and murmur their agreement. Mr. Miller, seeing his support wane, tightened his lips and sat down, glaring at Marcus but saying nothing more. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He had won this round, but he knew there was still work to be done to fully integrate his family into the community. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "Let's work together to make this neighborhood a place where everyone feels welcome. That's all my family has ever wanted." With that, the meeting slowly began to break up. Some neighbors approached Marcus to apologize, while others left quickly, avoiding eye contact. As Marcus gathered his things, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Mrs. Parker, who gave him a small, sincere smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Henderson," she said quietly. Marcus smiled back, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I appreciate that." As he walked out of the community center, Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but tonight he had made it clear that the Hendersons were here to stay and that they were not to be underestimated. The days following the community meeting brought a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. The open hostility that had once greeted the Hendersons at every turn began to wane, replaced by an uneasy silence. Some neighbors, like Mrs. Parker and Mrs. Johnson, made a genuine effort to reach out, offering apologies and tentative gestures of friendship. Others, however, including Mr. Miller, remained cold and distant, clearly resentful of the new power dynamics. Despite the changing atmosphere, Marcus knew that the battle was far from over. He had made his stand, but he also understood that deeply ingrained prejudices and resentment wouldn't disappear overnight. The Hendersons continued to go about their lives with dignity and determination, refusing to let the lingering tension affect their day-to-day activities. One afternoon, Marcus was working in his home office when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Lisa, who had just returned from a meeting with a client. "We need to talk," the message read. Marcus immediately felt a pang of concern. Lisa was not one to send ominous messages lightly. When Lisa arrived home, Marcus could see the worry etched on her face. She set her briefcase down and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "I had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Thompson today," she began, referring to the president of the Homeowners Association. Marcus leaned forward, his attention fully on her. "What happened?" "He pulled me aside after my meeting to discuss some concerns the association still has about us. He mentioned that some of the members are planning to file a formal complaint against us, claiming that we're causing unrest in the neighborhood." Lisa's voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the underlying frustration. "Unrest? They're the ones who've been harassing us," Marcus exclaimed, anger flaring up inside him. "What exactly are they planning to complain about?" Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "They're claiming that our presence has disrupted the peace and harmony of the community. They're trying to paint us as the problem, as if we're the ones who've been stirring up trouble." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he quickly tamped it down, knowing that they needed to stay focused. "This is just another attempt to push us out. They're hoping to create enough pressure to make us leave on our own." "But we're not going anywhere," Lisa said firmly. "And we're not going to let them frame us as the villains here." We need to get ahead of this. Marcus nodded in agreement. We'll need to gather evidence, document everything that's happened. If they want to play dirty, we'll be ready, and we'll make sure the truth is on our side. Over the next few days, Marcus and Lisa worked tirelessly to gather evidence of the harassment they had endured. They compiled photographs of the vandalism, saved copies of the threatening notes, and documented every interaction that could be considered hostile. Marcus also reached out to some of the more sympathetic neighbors, like Mrs. Parker and Mrs. Johnson, asking if they would be willing to speak up on their behalf if it came to that. While this was happening, Jasmine and Elijah continued to face challenges of their own. At school, Jasmine overheard some of her classmates talking about the situation, parroting the opinions of their parents. "They shouldn't even be here," one girl said. "My dad says they're just causing trouble." Jasmine, usually quiet and reserved, felt her temper flare. She had kept her head down, trying not to draw attention to herself, but now she was fed up. "We're not causing trouble," she snapped, turning to face the group. "We're just trying to live our lives, just like everyone else." The other kids were taken aback by Jasmine's outburst. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not used to being confronted. One boy, however, stepped forward. His name was Tyler, and he was one of the few students who had been kind to Jasmine since her family moved in. "She's right," Tyler said, his voice steady. "You guys don't even know what you're talking about. Just because your parents say something doesn't make it true." Jasmine felt a wave of gratitude toward Tyler. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. She gave him a small smile, and he nodded in return. The other kids, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, muttered something under their breaths and quickly walked away. Meanwhile, Elijah had his own challenges. He had always been a friendly, outgoing kid, but the tension in the neighborhood had started to take a toll on him. He noticed that some of the children he used to play with were now avoiding him, and it hurt more than he wanted to admit. But Elijah was resilient, and he tried to focus on the friends who stuck by him. One afternoon, as Elijah was playing basketball in the driveway, he noticed a group of kids from the neighborhood approaching. Among them was a boy named Ryan who had been particularly mean to Elijah since the Hendersons moved in. Ryan smirked as he approached, tossing the basketball from hand to hand. "You still playing alone, Henderson? Where's your team?" Elijah squared his shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I don't need a team to beat you, Ryan. Want to play one-on-one?" Ryan's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You're on." The game started, and Elijah poured all of his frustration and anger into it. He played hard, outmaneuvering Ryan at every turn. By the time the game ended, Elijah had won by a wide margin. Ryan, clearly embarrassed, tried to laugh it off, but Elijah could see the anger in his eyes. "Good game," Elijah said, trying to extend an olive branch. But Ryan just scowled and walked away, his friends following him. Elijah watched them go, feeling a mix of triumph and sadness. He had proven himself, but he knew that some of the kids would never accept him, no matter what he did. Still, he was determined not to let their attitudes bring him down. Back at home, Marcus and Lisa were ready to confront the homeowners association head-on. They had gathered all the evidence they needed and were prepared to defend their right to live in the neighborhood. The association had scheduled a meeting to discuss the concerns raised by the neighbors, and Marcus and Lisa were determined to be there. The night of the meeting, the tension was palpable. The association members sat at the front of the room, with Mr. Thompson in the center. Marcus and Lisa sat in the audience, surrounded by neighbors, some of whom they knew had been behind the harassment. Mr. Thompson began the meeting with the usual formalities, but it was clear that the main topic of discussion was the Hendersons. When the time came, Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We've received complaints from some members of this community regarding recent disturbances," he said carefully, avoiding direct accusations. "We want to ensure that everyone in this neighborhood feels safe and welcome, but it seems that some feel otherwise." Marcus stood up, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to address those concerns directly." All eyes turned to him, and Marcus could feel the weight of their stares. He took a deep breath and began. My family and I moved here because we believed this was a community where we could build a life, where our children could grow up feeling safe and accepted. But instead, we've been met with hostility, threats, and vandalism. We've documented everything, and we're prepared to take legal action if necessary. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, handing it to Mr. Thompson. These are copies of the police reports, photographs, and notes we've received. I think you'll find that the evidence speaks for itself. Mr. Thompson took the folder, clearly taken aback by the thoroughness of Marcus's preparation. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. As for the complaints about us, Marcus continued, his voice unwavering, they're baseless. We've done nothing to disrupt this community, and we've made every effort to be good neighbors. If anyone here feels otherwise, I'd like to hear why. The room was silent. Mr. Miller, who had been one of the main instigators, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Marcus scanned the room, making eye contact with each person, challenging them to speak up. Finally, Mrs. Johnson stood up. I was wrong, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I let myself get caught up in the negativity, and I regret it. The Hendersons have done nothing wrong, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else here. Her words hung in the air, and slowly others began to murmur in agreement. Mr. Thompson, realizing that the tide had turned, nodded solemnly. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson, and thank you, Mr. Henderson, for bringing this to our attention. We will review this evidence carefully, and I assure you that appropriate actions will be taken. Marcus sat down, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. They had faced the worst of it, and now, finally, they were being heard. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached Marcus and Lisa, offering apologies and assurances that they would support them moving forward. Marcus accepted their words with grace, but he knew it would take time to rebuild trust. As they left the community center, Marcus turned to Lisa and smiled. We did it, he said quietly. Lisa squeezed his hand. We did, but let's not let our guard down just yet. There's still work to be done. Marcus nodded, knowing she was right. But for the first time since they had moved in, he felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually start to change. The days following the homeowners association meeting were markedly different. While there was still an underlying tension in the air, it was clear that the tide had begun to turn. The overt acts of hostility against the Henderson family ceased, and the neighbors who had once been openly antagonistic now kept their distance, some even offering half-hearted nods when passing by. Marcus and Lisa, while relieved that the immediate threat had subsided, knew that the battle wasn't entirely over. The scars of the past few weeks were still fresh, and they understood that healing would take time, not just for their family, but for the entire neighborhood. One Saturday morning, as the family was enjoying breakfast together, they heard a knock at the door. Jasmine, who was nearest, went to answer it. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Parker, holding a tray of homemade cookies and looking slightly nervous. Good morning, Jasmine, Mrs. Parker said, offering a tentative smile. I was wondering if I could speak to your parents. Jasmine nodded and called out for her mom and dad. Marcus and Lisa exchanged a glance, both curious and cautious, before heading to the door. Good morning, Mrs. Parker. Lisa greeted her with a polite smile. How can we help you? Mrs. Parker shifted the tray in her hands, as if uncertain whether to offer it or hold on to it for comfort. I wanted to come by and apologize for everything. I was part of the problem, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for you and your family. Marcus and Lisa were silent for a moment, processing her words. Then Marcus stepped forward and took the tray from her hands. Thank you, Mrs. Parker. We appreciate that. It's been a rough few weeks, but we're willing to move forward if you are. Mrs. Parker's eyes filled with relief, and she smiled more genuinely this time. I'd like that. I know it will take time, but I want to make things right. As she left, Lisa closed the door and looked at Marcus, a thoughtful expression on her face. Do you think others will come around too? Marcus sighed, setting the tray down on the kitchen counter. Maybe, but whether they do or don't, we're going to keep living our lives. We've earned our place here. As the weeks went by, more neighbors began to make small gestures of reconciliation. Johnson invited Lisa to a book club meeting, where she was warmly welcomed by some of the women who had previously ignored her. Jasmine and Elijah noticed a change at school as well. While not everyone had come around, the bullying had stopped, and a few students even started sitting with Jasmine at lunch, including Tyler. One day, Mr. Miller, the man who had spearheaded much of the hostility, appeared on the Hendersons' doorstep. Marcus answered the door, surprised to see him standing there, looking uncharacteristically humble. "Mr. Henderson," Mr. Miller began, his voice lacking its usual bluster, "I came to apologize. I let my prejudices get the better of me, and I see now that I was wrong. I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time, and I've never been challenged like this before. But that's no excuse. I'm sorry for the way I treated you and your family." Marcus studied Mr. Miller for a long moment. He had been the most vocal opponent, the one who had orchestrated much of the harassment, and yet here he was, offering an apology. It wasn't easy to forgive someone who had caused so much pain, but Marcus knew that holding on to anger wouldn't help anyone. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Miller," Marcus said finally. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong. We're willing to move on, but it's going to take time to rebuild trust." Mr. Miller nodded, clearly relieved. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm going to do my best to make things right." After Mr. Miller left, Marcus sat down with Lisa, who had overheard the conversation from the living room. "Do you think he means it?" she asked. "I think he does," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "People can change, but it's up to him to prove it. In the meantime, we'll keep doing what we've been doing, living our lives and staying true to who we are." The turning point came during the neighborhood's annual block party. It was an event that the Hendersons had been excluded from when they first moved in. But this year they received a personal invitation from Mrs. Johnson. The party was held in the large park at the center of the neighborhood, with families bringing dishes to share and children playing games on the lawn. As the Hendersons arrived, they were greeted with a mix of smiles and polite nods. It wasn't the warmest reception, but it was a far cry from the cold hostility they had faced just weeks earlier. Marcus and Lisa exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to make the best of the situation. The family mingled, accepting compliments on the dishes they had brought and engaging in small talk with neighbors who were making an effort to be friendly. Jasmine and Elijah quickly joined a group of kids playing tag, laughing and running around the park without a care in the world. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself in a conversation with Mr. Thompson, the Homeowners Association president. "I'm glad to see you here, Marcus," Mr. Thompson said, raising his glass in a small toast. "It's been a tough road, but I think we're finally starting to see some positive change in the neighborhood." Marcus nodded, appreciating the sentiment. "It's been tough, but we're here to stay, and I think the neighborhood will be better for it." "I agree," Mr. Thompson replied, "and I want you to know that if there's ever anything you need, you can count on my support." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll keep that in mind." As the night drew to a close, the Hendersons sat together on a blanket, watching the stars appear in the sky. They were tired but happy, knowing that they had overcome one of the biggest challenges of their lives. The neighborhood might never be perfect, but it was their home, and they had fought hard to claim their place in it. "We did it," Lisa said softly, leaning her head on Marcus's shoulder. "We really did it." Marcus smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "Yeah, we did, and I think this is just the beginning. Things are going to get better from here." Jasmine and Elijah, exhausted from playing, snuggled up beside their parents. For the first time in a long while, the Hendersons felt a sense of peace. They had faced adversity head-on, stood up for themselves, and emerged stronger as a family. The neighborhood might still have its challenges, but the Hendersons knew that they had the strength to face whatever came their way. And with each passing day, they were slowly but surely turning their block into a true community, one where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel at home. The months that followed, the block party saw a gradual but noticeable transformation in the neighborhood. What began as tentative steps toward reconciliation blossomed into genuine efforts to build a more inclusive community. The Hendersons, once viewed with suspicion and hostility, were now becoming integral members of Evergreen Heights. One of the most significant changes came in the form of the neighborhood's annual charity event. Traditionally, this event had been organized by a small, insular group of residents, with the proceeds going to causes chosen by them. This year, however, things were different. Lisa was invited to join the planning committee, a gesture that signaled a true shift in the neighborhood's attitude. At the first meeting, Lisa was pleasantly surprised by the warmth and openness of the other committee members. Even Mr. Miller, who had been the most resistant to change, greeted her with a respectful nod. As the meeting progressed, Lisa suggested that the charity event support a local organization that provided scholarships to underprivileged students, many of whom were from diverse backgrounds. To her surprise and delight, the suggestion was met with unanimous approval. It was a small victory, but one that represented a broader change in the community's mindset. On the day of the event, the Hendersons arrived early to help set up. The park was filled with colorful tents, food stalls, and a stage for performances. There was a sense of excitement in the air, and for the first time since they moved in, the Hendersons felt truly at home. As the event got underway, Marcus took a moment to stand back and observe. He watched as neighbors who had once avoided them now chatted with Lisa, complimenting her on the success of the event. Jasmine and Elijah were running around with their friends, laughing and carefree. It was a stark contrast to the fear and tension that had once gripped the neighborhood. "Quite a turnout," Mr. Miller said, walking up beside Marcus. His tone was no longer laced with the disdain it once held. Instead, there was a hint of respect. "It really is," Marcus replied, nodding. "I'm glad to see everyone coming together like this." Mr. Miller sighed, looking out at the crowd. "I didn't think it would happen, but you and your family, you showed us that things needed to change. I'm just sorry it took me so long to see it." Marcus appreciated the honesty in Mr. Miller's words. It's not easy to change, especially when you've lived a certain way for so long, but what matters is that you did. Mr. Miller nodded, then extended his hand. "Here's to a better neighborhood, Marcus." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "To a better neighborhood." As the day went on, the charity event exceeded everyone's expectations. The community raised more money than ever before, and the sense of unity was palpable. The barriers that had once divided them were slowly crumbling, replaced by a shared commitment to making Evergreen Heights a place where everyone felt welcome. As the sun began to set, the Hendersons found themselves surrounded by new friends and allies. They were no longer the outsiders. They were part of the fabric of the community. Later that evening, as the family walked home, Jasmine and Elijah talked excitedly about the day's events. They were finally at peace, knowing that their family was accepted and valued in the place they called home. "I'm proud of us," Lisa said, her voice filled with emotion. "We didn't give up, and now look at what we've accomplished." Marcus smiled, pulling her close. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. We've shown that change is possible, even in the face of adversity." As they reached their front door, Marcus paused and looked around the neighborhood. The streetlights cast a warm glow over the houses, and for the first time, it truly felt like a place of belonging. "We've built something special here," Marcus said quietly, "and it's just the beginning. There's still work to be done, but we're not alone anymore." Lisa nodded, squeezing his hand. "We're stronger together, and no matter what comes next, we'll face it as a family." The Hendersons stepped inside their home, closing the door behind them. The battles they had fought were not forgotten, but they had emerged victorious, not just by standing up to the hostility they faced, but by transforming their community into a place of acceptance and respect. And so, Evergreen Heights became not just a neighborhood, but a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together with open hearts and minds. The Hendersons had found their place, and in doing so, they had paved the way for others to do the same. As they settled in for the night, the family gathered in the living room, feeling the warmth of their home and the strength of their bond. They knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but they were ready to face them, together. And for the first time, they knew that Evergreen Heights was not just where they lived, it was where they belonged.